The flight to Rostov of our group of 6 Yak-1s was headed by the Squadron Commander A. Kamosa. He assigned me to be his wingman. On the route, conducting a circular search, I saw 20 enemy planes coming from the west. They were heading for the railroad junction, Lykovskaya. I jumped out in front of the group, shook the airplane to warn about the enemy, and went towards the enemy with a combat turn. When approaching, I determined that they were Mi-110 fighter bombers. They have a powerful armament in the nose of the airplane. We had already met them west of Voroshilovgrad. Going into a frontal attack against the Mi-110 is clearly unprofitable. I put my plane in the climb. 5 of our Yaks turned in a frontal attack. It was a tactical error of the unit commander. A group of Mi-110s, having dropped bombs in the field, tightly closed their formation and met our fighters with powerful traces of fire, forcing them immediately with a decline to the side. After that, the Mi-110s became in a defensive circle to protect them from our possible attacks. Using the excess over the enemy, I made several successive attacks. I expected Kamosa's group to appear at altitude, but it left on the route. Mi-110, seeing that they are attacked by a single fighter, themselves went on the attack, pouring my plane from all sides of the traces of cannon and machine gun fire. Here I had to think how to get out of this fight. Having caught a convenient moment, with a sharp dive I left the battle. Having flown to Rostov, I saw all our 5 on the ground. I approached Kamosa and asked him, "Why didn't you fight with Mi-110? "How could I? They put such a barrier to us that I wonder how no one was shot down," responded the squadron commander. "And is it right to go head-on at the same altitude with them? You have 5 guns, and the enemy has 48. We should have previously gained altitude and attack from above. The main thing is that we made them drop their bombs in the field before reaching the target, and we didn't lose any of our own. Did you manage to shoot them down?" "I don't think so, but I think I made a few holes in them. I didn't have time to watch the results of the attacks. Toward the end, they started to chase me too, and I barely got away," answered. From the conversation, it became clear that Kamosa does not share my dissatisfaction with my actions against the group of Mi-110. I decided not to return to this issue now, and things did not keep me waiting. It was necessary to prepare pilots of the squadron for combat work on the new frontier, on the approach to the Don. Soon we received a task for combat sorties. Again began hard work reconnaissance, attacking the advancing enemy, covering the crossings of our retreating troops across the Don. Behind this water barrier, refugees hoped to find salvation. Retreating units were secured. The enemy came out on a wide front to the river. It was a difficult time. You look at the right bank of the Don, and as if again the picture that I had to observe last year on the Dnieper is repeated. Refugees mixed with retreating military units move in streams along all roads, merging at the crossings. People, equipment wagons are waiting for their turn for the ferries. Our task is to cover them, to prevent their destruction. The enemy aviation was persistently tearing to the crossings. The enemy sought to disrupt the organized crossing of the river, to destroy the refugees, not to allow the retreating troops to occupy the defense along the Don. The pilots of the regiment were well aware of the responsibility that fell on their shoulders in those difficult days. The tension was great from early morning until late evening. They stormed enemy columns, fought air battles, patrolled, repulsed attacks of bombers. The situation in the air was difficult. The enemy at this time had almost tenfold superiority in aircraft, and to somehow compensate for this, had to go to unprecedented tension in combat sorties. In these hard June days, the flight crew had a break only in the minutes of refueling aircraft fuel and ammunition. The heat was exhausting, the dust was bothering. All this required a lot of strength, energy, a large stock of mental fortitude. And how hard it was to realize that the Red Army was retreating, that the enemy was capturing more and more new areas. In those days it was hard to recognize the pilots. They lost weight, blackened faces, and not so much from the sun as from excessive tension, moral and physical. But the consciousness of duty, hatred of the enemy, the fighting spirit were high. Air fighters found strength to fulfill their tasks, to strike at the enemy. When the task was set to attack ground targets, The commander, as a rule, emphasized do not be distracted by other targets. The main thing is to break the column. Returning, sometimes met groups of junkers. Covered by fighters, they went to the crossings. How could we pass by quietly? We pounced on them, trying to prevent them from reaching their targets. As a rule, we forced them to drop their bombs in the field. Sometimes we had to attack even without ammunition. I will not deny that I got hit for such initiative. But the pilots were understandable. We could imagine the joy of people at the crossings, when our fighters saved them from bombing, and reproaches to our aviation for the fact that they could not prevent the enemy bombers from striking. Yes, it was a difficult time. Soon enemy tanks approached the suburbs of Rostov. The enemy aviation systematically bombed the city and the airfield. The regiment flew over the Don to Bataisk. But even there our work and night rest were hindered by frequent blocking of the airfield during the day, strikes of enemy night bombers in the dark. After a busy day, pilots could not sleep well. Explosions of bombs on the airfield often lifted us out of bed. In Bataisk was received an order to send to the aircraft workshops for overhaul of airplanes that had exhausted their engine life. From the regiment went to the rear squadron Fijichov on MiG-3 and crews on Yak-1 airplanes under the command of Kamoza. All those who stayed behind to continue combat work saw them off with envy. I wanted to sleep terribly. There were such minutes when they could not hold their legs. The pilot fell asleep as soon as the plane rolled into the parking lot. There were 2 incomplete squadrons left in the regiment, each of which had 8 shabby Yak-1s, one under my command and the other Pavel Kryukov. Now the load was even greater. The remaining staff had to fulfill combat tasks for the entire regiment. The places of our combat operations were moving more and more to the east of Rostov, along the Don, where the enemy, forcing the river, broke through to the North Caucasus. We flew out to cover our crossings and to make assault strikes on the enemy. And in Rostov street battles began. This forced us to relocate to the south, to the village of Kushchevskaya. We flew there by squadron after the attack on the enemy columns that had crossed at the village Semikarakorskaya. They landed, drove to the parking lot. There were no aviation technicians and bow workers. We realized that they were still on their way. There was nothing to load airplanes, no fuel, ammunition, or compressed air. The fighter regiment and maintenance battalion on the airfield could not help. I used the little forced rest to familiarize myself with the regiment. At the front, he arrived recently. Formed already in a new organization, 20 aircraft and pilots. The flight crew had no combat experience. The regiment's leadership began combat operations by flying groups made up of squadron commanders, their deputies and wing commanders. Many of them were shot down or wounded in fierce battles with the enemy, who had already been shelled. Young ordinary pilots remained in the regiment. Now there was no one to take them to combat missions. This practice of flying groups, made up of senior personnel, negatively showed itself at the beginning of the war. But apparently some people have not yet abandoned it. Thus the regiment was incapable, although it had more than 10 new Yak-1s fully fueled and ready for flight. The commander of the unit Belov asked me to take his pilots on a mission. In order not to lose time while our planes were refueled, I immediately agreed. Not knowing the flight crew, I decided to secure this sortie just in case, including experienced pilots from my squadron. Nomenko and Berezhnoi went into the air with me as a pair of cover. We're flying. Our 8 approaches to Menik. The group tried to attack 2 Mi-109s, but Nomenko's covering pair entered the battle in time. Remaining 6, we struck at the crossing and lit up several cars on the dam and near it. We still had ammunition. But I decided to stop the assault. First of all, the task is mostly accomplished. And secondly, a pair of Messerschmitts that met us could call for reinforcements by radio and attack when returning to the airfield. We need to save some ammunition. The assumption was justified. Soon after the withdrawal from Menik, I saw the Messerschmitts coming to attack. I warned by rocking the airplane about the appearance of the enemy, then vigorously turned around. To my surprise, no one from the group followed me. All 5 Yaks, confused, went on a course to Kushchevka. Messerschmitts, not paying attention to me, went on the attack on the departing Yaks. The first attack was repulsed by barrage fire. In the second attack, I managed to shoot the leader of the 4 Mi-109s at point-blank range. Then the remaining 3 pounced on me. Reflecting their onslaught and attacking myself, I quickly used up the rest of my ammunition and remained unarmed against 3 enemy fighters. Now could save only a high technique of piloting. We spun a Ferris wheel in the sky. Hitler's pilots, apparently, having made sure that I could not be shot down, or maybe they were running out of fuel, stopped attacks, formed a group and turned in the northern direction. I immediately set a course for the airfield. I landed and taxied over. I see that the whole group is already quietly waiting for me. At the control room, Belov asked, "Well, how was the flight? Can my pilots be allowed to go on missions?" They acted well during the attack, but they were not ready for air battles. Psychologically, it's too early for them to fight with the Messers. They can be allowed to go on combat missions only together with experienced pilots. Why don't you fly with them one more time? No, I can't. We have our own mission. It's a pity that you have lost the leaders, I answered, although I knew that I would upset Belov. I will remember this flight for a long time. And indeed it taught a lot, made me think deeply about how important it is to psychologically get along with all pilots with whom you go into battle. We often say to understand your comrade, combat bonding. These are very important qualities in combat. They must be fostered, instilled in pilots long before meeting the enemy. Combat rapport is born in a pair, in a link, in a squadron. I have always been a supporter of stable combat groups, in which all airmen know and like each other well. Only in this case the pilots of the group will act as a coherent fighting unit. This does not mean, of course, that such actions restrain impulse, creativity, and initiative. No, on the contrary. The belief that in the toughest battle no one will hide his head, will cover if necessary, inspires, leads to courageous actions. Without that there can be no victory. Soon the headquarters and technical staff of the regiment, soldiers of the maintenance battalion arrived at the airfield. Airplanes were loaded and ready for combat work. In the morning began active storming of enemy troops who crossed the Menik Canal. We flew out in 8s, specially allocated pairs to suppress anti-aircraft guns. This ensured success and helped to avoid losses. In those days we were waiting for the return of a group of pilots who were sent to repair airplanes. How they were needed now. The delay worried the command of the regiment. After a few days we managed to find out that they had been refused to receive the airplanes. Aircraft repair shops, having curtailed their work, withdrew to the east. The regiment commander decided to fly there himself and negotiate the acceptance of aircraft, but his preparation for the flight ended with a serious wound. When starting the engine on the UT-2, the mechanic turned on the ignition early. From the impact of the propeller blade, Major Ivanov's arm was fractured, and he ended up in the hospital. The report of this was very upsetting for everyone. Under the command of Viktor Petrovich Ivanov, we have come a long and hard way. He led the regiment from the first days of the war. No one was as respected by us as he was. We saw him as a senior battle comrade and friend. A few days later, before dinner, the Chief of Staff announced the order to appoint Zayev commander of the regiment. After hearing it, the pilots silently looked at each other. The reaction of the officers angered Zayev, and he, looking at us, said, "It should be remembered that by order from today I am the commander of the regiment and will impose strict order. From now on it will not be like it was before." There was order in the regiment under Ivanov. We became guardsmen, I retorted. "And with you, Pokrishkin, I will have a separate conversation." The commander left. We spent a few minutes in silence to comprehend everything that had happened. The entry into office of the new commander affected the order of our combat operations. On the assault ground, targets began to fly in formation, rather than squadron by squadron. This increased losses. Soon there were 6 airplanes left in the squadrons. It is good that the pilots, having received wounds and burns, remained alive. The area of military operations was moving east of Rostov. The breakthrough of enemy tank groups across the Don, in the areas of Kotelnikovskaya and Timlyanskaya stations, increasingly pressed the troops of the southern front to the Caucasus Mountains. To be closer to the places of assaults, the regiment was forced to relocate to a field airfield near Kropotkin. The first to arrive there was our squadron. And this time the aircraft technicians and the rear part, relocating by motor transport, did not have time to arrive in time for our arrival. The pilots pushed the airplanes into the caponiers and waited for the ground echelon. At that time we saw 9 U-88s at low altitude heading in the direction of Kropotkin. We had little fuel and ammunition left in the airplanes, and yet on my command all of us quickly took off and attacked the 9. The strike was unexpected for the enemy. Junkers dropped bombs, not reaching the target, and tried to get away to the north. Pursuing them, we completely shot out the remaining shells and ammunition, and on the last drops of fuel made a landing. In the turmoil of the battle, no one could determine exactly how many enemy vehicles were shot down or damaged. The main thing, they disrupted the bombing by enemy planes of the railroad junction, packed with echelons. After landing again, dragged the fighters into the caponiers and camouflaged them. Without fuel and ammunition, they were just a target for enemy aircraft. When will our column arrive? I went out to the road that runs next to the airfield. I saw the locals, said Hello asked. Tell me how often the German aviation makes raids on the city. Every morning. As soon as it dawns, they're here. They come and bomb the station and the town. Thank you for driving them off today. They'll stop being cheeky soon enough, I promised, thinking of a way to intercept them in the morning. Soon Pavel Kryakov's squadron landed, combining, like us, relocation with an assault. Only at dusk arrived by automobile headquarters headed by the regimental commander, technical staff and maintenance battalion. Refueled aircraft fuel and ammunition. Prepared for a combat flight. I report to the regiment commander on the results of our assault and interception of bombers. Suggested organizing a morning watch to intercept a probable raid on Kropotkin enemy bombers. Let this is engaged in air defense. We will have a lot of their tasks, replied Zayev. We must not allow the enemy to bomb the city with impunity. Early in the morning tasks are not yet received and we will have time to intercept Junkers, I tried to convince the commander. He remained silent, sat down in the MQ and left. Did not say yes or no. I decided not to give up my idea. I consulted with the pilots of the squadron. We stayed overnight at the airfield, did not go to the village. It was impossible to persuade Kryakov to do it, the pilots were very overworked. His unit went to the village for a rest. We had dinner with technicians, settled down on covers under the wings of their airplanes. The night was warm, they rested well. And with dawn, not having found Iskrin sleeping in the landings, we with Nomenko and Berezhny sat in the cockpits, took the first readiness, and Fedorov's pair the second, at their airplanes. The sun was already beginning to rise, and there was still no enemy. Upset, I got out of the cockpit, and, without taking off my parachute, lay down on the wing to take a nap. Suddenly I hear Chuvashkin shouting. Comrade Commander, they're flying. I saw a group of airplanes consisting of 12 U-88s and 6 Mi-110s. In one fell swoop, I jumped into the cockpit, in a second started the engine, and took off. My partners followed me. Taking off, I looked at the enemy, taking a course to Kropotkin, and did not notice the second group approaching the airfield. We shot down 2 bombers with swift attacks, and forced the Junkers to drop their bombs in the field before reaching the city. Pursuing the escaping enemy, we shot down 2 more planes and, having used up ammunition, turned to the airfield. On the way to us was attached to a pair of Fedorov. I landed and, to my surprise, I saw craters on the landing strip. I had to land a little to the side. Already on the ground it turned out that the airfield was bombed by 15 Mi-110s. Fedorov's pair fought with them, having shot down 1 airplane, and prevented Messerschmitts from attacking the airfield. Bombs fell on the runway and in the caponiers, from which our 5 took off. Apparently the enemy noticed, from which caponiers we took off to repel the bombing yesterday, and decided to destroy our planes on the ground. This flight disrupted the bombing of the city and saved our fighters. If we had not organized the duty, half of the remaining planes in the regiment would have been destroyed, and the results of the battle were high. My 3 shot down 4 planes and 1 burned Fedorov's pair. I announced to the pilots gathered around me. We flew and fought as a 5-man team. We shot down 5 planes. All participated actively. Probably it will be right to count everyone on the airplane. Such a decision was not accidental. It was important to arouse in young pilots the desire to act in the common interest, to show that they appreciate their contribution to the victory. Soon the pilots of Kryukov's squadron arrived at the airfield, followed by the regiment commander. We did not hear any reproaches from him, but no praise either. Just rolled the planes into the Caponiers, as at the airfield arrived several officers from the division, headed by the commander of the compound. After looking around the bombs-turned Caponiers, craters on the airfield, Division Commander Shevchenko, he replaced Osipenko, sharply asked Zayev, "How do you understand this? Your airfield is being bombed, and you sit and wait for airplanes to burn on the ground. Are you relying on air defense aviation? Is that it?" "Negative, Comrade General. The pilots on duty didn't let them bomb the city, but the Germans still dropped bombs on the airfield, but they didn't allow the fighters to attack the airfield. The air battle was conducted only by the pilots of the regiment, and from the air defense there was not a single plane in the air." Listening to their conversation, it was not difficult to imagine the situation of the commander of the unit. Could have been destroyed aircraft regiment, and the replenishment of new ones in the current situation could not be counted on. For successful actions against 33 U-88 and Mi-110 Command ordered to present to award all pilots of our 5. All week the enemy aviation did not appear in the area of our basing. We continued hard combat work. We made assault strikes on the advancing enemy troops south of Salsk, as well as on his tank corps, forcing the Don near the village Tsimleonskaya and advancing on Stavropol. The front line was getting closer and closer to Kropotkin. At the airfield was heard firing artillery. The regiment was ordered to relocate east of Stavropol and act on the left flank of the advancing enemy. Our ground troops there were few and the pilots had a heavy load. Flights for assault, charging the aircraft with fuel and ammunition, again assault. And so until darkness fell. The flight crew was exhausted. A 4-hour night's sleep did not restore their strength. Among those who were physically weaker, there was fatigue. In some pilots' decreased reaction action, they became slow, lethargic. And this dreamed of losses from anti-aircraft fire and in aerial combat. It was necessary to give the pilots at least a short rest. There was only one hope to replace them with the flying staff that had left from Bataisk to ferry planes for repair. Kryukov and I begged Zayev for such a substitution. He agreed and allowed me to fly to Stavropol, where, according to some sources, was our flying group, which had not handed over the planes to the aircraft workshops. We flew out in a U-2. I sat in the second cabin. The airplane was flown by a regular pilot. We bypassed Stavropol for safety, appeared over the airfield, separated from the city by a forest. Neither people nor equipment on the airfield was not, only stood alonely in yellow stains, MiG-3. And on the ground were blackened remnants of burned I-16s and cars. In the side, in the forest, rising clouds of smoke periodically heard explosions. Apparently a warehouse of bombs was burning. The situation was alarming. The pilot of the U-2 did not want to land at first. He landed only at my request. "We are going down." I look carefully into the forest on the side of the strip and do not follow the ground. We landed with a bang. From a rough landing, the bolt securing the landing gear to the fuselage sheared off. The airplane tilted. After examining the failure, the pilot got nervous. "That's it, we can't take off." "Don't panic. We'll find technicians or repair it ourselves." There was no one at the parking lots. The airfield was empty. I decided to go to the burning warehouse. Maybe there was someone left there. I came closer and was hit by a strong explosion of bombs. I fell to the ground, covering my head with my hands. It became clear that there was no one here. I had to go back to the U-2. Near it I saw 3 men, dressed in civilian clothes. "Do you know where the Air Force went from here?" "No, why did you come here?" "The Germans have been in town since yesterday. Fly away quickly." We'll leave now. Help us to repair the plane, I asked. I found a piece of thick wire in the parking lots. Then we lifted the plane on the wing. Instead of the cut bolt, inserted the wire into the knots and wrapped it around the landing gear strut. So primitively fixed the landing gear. It was possible to fly. But I decided not to leave the spackled, unpainted MiG-3, but to burn it. I examined the airplane. It was fully filled with fuel, with a battery and quite ready for departure. Decided to hijack it. Gave instructions to the pilot. The MiG seems to be in good working order. I'll test it on the ground and take off. If everything works fine, I'll swing the wing to you, you take off too. If there are serious malfunctions, I'll sit down, burn the airplane and fly with you. Understood. But first, help me start the engine. Having done everything necessary, I went to the MiG. I put the cover removed from it on the seat instead of a parachute, sat down and started the engine. It worked perfectly. The roar was over the whole field. Turned onto the runway, took off. I put the lever to retract the landing gear, but they did not retract. There was little compressed air in the tank, and the air compressor did not work. It was very dangerous to fly with the landing gear not retracted. It could lead to overheating of the engine and its jamming. And a forced landing with released landing gear threatened to completely capsize the airplane and kill it, as it happened to Kostya Mironov at the beginning of the war. It is necessary to land and destroy the airplane on the ground. I turned to the airfield. The U-2 was no longer there. Now there was only one thing left to go to the regiment. Flying over the roofs of Stavropol houses, I saw on the streets dozens of tanks with crosses on their sides. That's when I became really scared, and for our ill-conceived landing, and for all the actions on the airfield. Only now I realized what great danger we were exposing ourselves to. At dusk I flew to the part. The landing strip was poorly visible. I made the landing approach by the white railroad house at the crossing, which had served as a landmark for us before. Green flares of the finisher allowed landing. I had almost leveled the airplane over the ground, as suddenly a red flare forbade landing. My hand moved the throttle sector forward out of habit. But then I quickly came to my senses, realizing that on this overheated engine I would not be able to go for a second round. I take off the throttle and sit down, watching the situation carefully. At the end of the run I saw ahead, on the edge of the landing strip, standing I-16. I managed to skip past them by a vigorous turn to the side. I taxied to the parking lot. Immediately came up Chuvashkin. He reported that a group from Markelov's regiment had landed on our airfield, in the parking lot of which I had almost smeared in the dark. And this, in all probability, would have happened if I had gone for a second round after the red rocket fired by the finisher. But everything turned out safely. All's well that ends well. The main thing, I was satisfied that I brought MiG-3 from the airfield captured by the enemy. I went to the mess hall for dinner. The pilots immediately surrounded me. Everyone was interested in the results of the flight to Stavropol. I told them about all the circumstances. Pavel Krukov reproached me. You did not act wisely, Sasha. Could have fallen into the clutches of the enemy. Nothing. Risk is a noble thing. He who does not risk does not win. I tried to justify myself, although I realized that I had acted wrongly. At the end of dinner in the dining room came a pilot from the U-2, with which I flew to Stavropol airfield. He saw me and approached me. I was waiting for him to tell me about the premature takeoff before my air signals. I didn't chicken out, don't look like that, he started. It turned out that watching me in the forest, the pilot saw the enemy motorcyclists. They were entering the airfield on the road from the city. Nothing else could not be done in these conditions. He instantly went for takeoff, accompanied in pursuit by traces of automatic rifles. The hijacked airplane caused a lot of trouble for both the technician and me. When relocating to a new airfield, after ferrying the MiG, I returned for my yak, because there were no extra pilots in the regiment. Thus, Chuvashkin and I had 2 machines in our care. The technical staff was clearly dissatisfied with the trophy. At the first distillation, Chuvashkin, preparing the MiG-3 for flight, grumbled. You have taken, Comrade Commander, a burden to the regiment. You can't abandon it. and no one takes it for repair, but there is enough work with it. The airplane will be repaired, and it will be possible to fight on it, I argued. Look what happens. The adapter from the cylinder with compressed air from the Yak does not fit the MiG. Therefore, the airplane cannot be charged with compressed air and hardly manage to start the engine. You'll break your neck, Pokryshkin, on this MiG. In an emergency landing with the landing gear not retracted on it will certainly skapoteretsia, warned me the engineer of the regiment Kopylov. What can be done? Nothing, so we'll have to agonize with starting the engine, and you risk at distances, voting released landing gear. With your MiG it turns out, like in the saying, a woman had no troubles, but bought a piglet. We have to find a repair shop and take it in for repair. Kopylov pleased me. At each flight of the MiG technicians remembered the designers for the non-standard airplane equipment, and such dangerous flights had to perform more and more often. The enemy, forcing the Don, continued the offensive. His corps and divisions, flowing around the right wing of the southern front, were rushing to the oil fields of Grozny and Baku. And as it became known later, this would open the way to the fulfillment of Hitler's adventurist plan to the exit of his armies through Iran to Iraq and India, to join the successfully advancing in Africa Rommel and the Japanese militarists. The retreat of ground troops forced our regiment to change airfields frequently. By mid-August we were already based near Budnovsky. To the north and east stretched sparsely populated endless steppes, and to the south the foothills of the Caucasus Range. The main types of combat work in these August days were assaulting columns and artillery positions, as well as escorting P-2 bombers when they struck the enemy. They acted successfully without losses. But in those days the personnel of the regiment for the first time, probably, had some new feeling they were tormented by the thought, where we would be based in the future. After all, we were backed up by the Caucasus. Everyone was worried about the expectation of replenishment. There were few airplanes and pilots left in the unit. After one of the assault sorties by the squadron, coming to the airfield, I accelerated the plane in a steep descent and performed a double ascending barrel roll. It was a kind of report to those on the ground about a successful combat flight. I saw 2 Yaks standing on the landing strip with a roll obviously broken landing gear. The planes, judging by the colouring of the propeller cocks, were from another unit. I sat down between them, drove into the parking lot. Who broke some wood there? Asked Chuvashkin. Pilots of the neighbouring regiment. Apparently they were damaged in the battle. On the way to the CP saw pilots sitting at their planes. Among them immediately recognised familiar to me Dmitry and Boris Glinok. It became clear that Dizasov's regiment had flown to us. I came up and said hello. But I didn't have time to talk. I was in a hurry to report on the results of the assault. There I asked the Chief of Staff. Did they come to our aid and immediately started with the breakdowns? Their tanks almost got them. That's why they flew in broken planes. That's it. Last night Neumenko and I landed with them. The airfield wasn't far from us. Tomorrow the tanks could be here too. We must leave here today, I said anxiously. We won't have to. We received an order to hand over the airplanes to Dusov's regiment and go to Baku for retraining and to get new equipment. What news? The message did not fit in my mind. How can it be? Everyone will be at war, and we will be in the rear sunbathing at such a time. I spoke out more for myself than for the Chief of Staff. I understood. More than once I spoke about the need to give pilots a chance to rest a little from the continuous exhausting combat work, but to switch off completely from combat operations in the most difficult situation at the front. After all, only recently read the Order of Supreme Commander in Chief Stalin N-227, which sounded the demand not a step back. No, all this did not fit in my consciousness. I returned to the parking lot to the Yak. Around it, having opened the hoods, were checking the engine of the technicians of the neighbouring regiment. Seeing me, Chuvashkin joyfully said, "All, Comrade Commander, the airplane turned in. Now it's our turn to rest." "What are you happy about?" "Everyone will fight, and we will rest," I reproached him. I did not like the genuine joy Chuvashkin, although I realized that I should not reproach him. He is a real fighter, but over the past few days very tired, exhausted to the limit, like all the personnel of the regiment. And no wonder the technicians served from dawn to darkness combat sorties, and at night repaired damaged aircraft. And how can you dismiss the bombing of enemy aircraft, raids on the airdrome? Shuvashkin was one of many thousands of those people who forged our victory, worked tirelessly and risked their lives to achieve it. By evening all airplanes were transferred to the regiment of I.M. Dzusov, except for the MiG, which I overtook from near Stavropol. I tried to persuade the regiment commander myself. Dzusov categorically replied, "Our regiment is a combat regiment, not a repair shop. We will not accept a defective airplane, and even not suitable for the type." I realized that we had to keep driving it to the rear to surrender it somewhere along the way, near the command post built pilots and technicians. The commander read out the order about surrender of airplanes and the order of moving to Baku. I and Kryukov were instructed to pick up the flight crew to drive the surrendered aircraft to the new location of the regiment I.M. Dzusov. I knew that if for this purpose to allocate ordinary pilots, who do not yet have the guards rank, they will not return to us. They would be immediately left in a new unit. Therefore, we included ourselves and squadron commanders in this list. Guardsmen are not transferred to other regiments. Dzusov categorically objected to this decision. "Why do I need squadron and wing commanders? I have enough of my own. Let the airplanes ferry ordinary pilots." "Do you want to get combat pilots in addition to airplanes?" I answered. "The regiment needs them." The commander of our regiment listened to the conversation in silence, but it was obvious that he was dissatisfied with my behavior, does not share my concerns, and I was sure that I had acted reasonably. And of course it was not because I was defending private interest. Our units had already formed a strong and cohesive combat team, developed a habit of each other. In battle we learned to understand our partners without words. This largely ensured the success of battles. Is it reasonable to destroy such a fighting family? This day began unusually for us. We received a command to load equipment onto vehicles. The personnel were preparing to move. It didn't occur to me that we were going to the rear. It was even somehow uncomfortable without combat missions. The airfield was empty after the departure of I.M. Dzusov's regiment. In the parking lot stood alone in yellow putty MiG-3. It was left in my care. I had to take it to the repair shops. I was supposed to fly to Beslan, where, according to the received information, there was a repair group of the regiment, but the command came late, dusk was getting dark, and I was assigned to land for an overnight stay at the airfield near Sovetskaya village. Here I landed. I'm taxiing in. I see an Emka heading towards me. To my surprise, Dzusov himself climbed up on the wing of the airplane. "Taking a closer look at me," he said with a grin. "Ah, an old acquaintance." On his inseparable came. "You did not take it, and to leave the enemy would be a crime. Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, you'll pardon me for not agreeing to give you pilots to ferry planes. Good for you for standing up for them. Of course they wouldn't have come back to you. It feels like your regiment doesn't have a real master who values his men. Drive your airplane and be accommodated with ours," Dzusov instructed and left. A short conversation. A few minutes of communication caused me a deep sympathy for this commander. I had no idea that I would have to fight under the command of Ibrahim Magomitovich Dzusov for a long time. Early in the morning I took to the air. The brakes on my airplane did not work. I took it into account when landing. With the engine running I landed at the very beginning of the runway. On the run, I zigzagged the airplane. I barely stopped it at the very end of the airfield, almost hitting an obstacle with the propeller. I taxied to the parking lot and saw a broken MiG-3 to the left of the flying field. I immediately recognized it as the plane of our regiment. The camouflage coloring on it was special. This MiG was called Zebra. Someone from our pilots, I thought anxiously. In the parking lot approached the technicians, who crashed. Supran. After takeoff, the engine failed on takeoff. During the turn, the plane went into a corkscrew. Supran was killed, and the engineer Kopilov, sitting behind the armoured backrest, got off with bruises. The technicians told me the tragedy. I stood silent for a moment, shocked by the death of a remarkable pilot. He fought for almost a year, shot down half a dozen enemy planes. It hurts to tears when battle friends die in a disaster. When did it happen? This morning. The funeral is scheduled for tonight, said A. Camosa. The funeral should be postponed until tomorrow. The whole regiment will arrive and will bury him in a solemn manner. Take care of this issue, I asked Camosa and ordered Chuvashkinu to do everything, but hand over the MiG here. Broken airplane, the death of Supran, all this has strongly affected me. I'm dragging myself on this wreck. No brakes, everything is at the limit. I can easily repeat the sad story of my friend, I thought. I decided not to test my fate in the foothills of the Caucasus. I said goodbye to Supran in the morgue. Then I sat on a bench for a long time. I could not recover. In the evening I went to the flight canteen for dinner. There I saw our pilots. They were sitting in silence. They didn't notice me. I approached them. Why are you so depressed? And we, Sasha, organized a wake for Supran, replied Camosa. It's bad. It won't help Stepan. Tomorrow we'll bury him as we should, with honors. On Vorontsov's orders, they have already buried Stepan. I told you to wait until the whole regiment arrives. Ask Vorontsov about it. There he sits. Camosa pointed to a table in the corner of the dining room. When he approached Vorontsov, he could not contain his indignation. His soul was burning with resentment. Of course, Supran deserved that the entire regiment to see him off. In the morning, the ground echelon arrived. The personnel of our unit laid bouquets of flowers on Supran's grave. That day and later, when the fresh pain of loss had passed, I thought more than once about Vorontsov's decision. Probably he was afraid that the funeral will knock the pilots out of the rut, affect the mood. A profound mistake. During the war, we lost combat friends. Combat pilots died in hot fights, and under bombing, and in disasters. These are combat losses. And we all treated it with understanding. We knew that our lives were given in the fight for victory, paying tribute to the dead. Pilots kept their friends in memory, avenged them. Mentally they were with us, multiplying our strength, our combat capabilities. Camosa's group was preparing to transfer airplanes to Makhachkala. I asked him to allocate me a car to fly behind the group. Take the yak, which Vorontsov was driving to repair. He had a good rest while you were fighting in the steppes of the Don and in the foothills of the Caucasus. Let him shake on the car now, he advised. An hour later we set off on the route. I was following the group. Before reaching Gudums, one of the yaks had an engine failure. The pilot made an emergency landing. I immediately went forward and helped him to choose a landing site. After landing, the pilot stood on the seat in the cockpit, waved to me and pointed in the direction of Makhachkala. I realized that his landing was okay. I caught up with the group over the intermediate airfield. The airplanes, stretched out one after another, were going around in a circle, but there was nowhere to land. On the ground, tractors with windrows were moving and rolling the field landing strip. Something had to be done. The fuel would run out and the pilots would start landing anywhere. I took a risk and landed the car in the unharvested crops, next to the tractors. Jumping out of the plane, I asked the tractor drivers, "Where's the nearest airfield?" "The airfield is just being built here." "And you can't land here, and we don't know where the others are," I heard in reply. I decided to fly to Makhachkala. I took off, shook the airplane from wing to wing, and brought the group to Makhachkala. Only Camosa did not reach Makhachkala, having used up all the fuel, landed with retracted landing gear near the airfield under construction, slightly damaging the airplane. Having handed over their airplanes to the aircraft repair plant and having arranged accommodation, we found out the address of VP. Karpovich at the military enlistment office. He was recovering at home after being wounded. We went to see him. Karpovich was sincerely happy, but we could feel some tension in him, especially in his wife. "Are you not happy about your battle friends?" frankly asked Karpovich. "What are you saying?" My wife and I are glad that we have not forgotten. But understand correctly, we are now at a loss, there is nothing to treat you. In the rear, all the people live hard, food is on cards. And now we are in a difficult situation with food, he said shyly. Well, is it a serious matter? We'll go and buy what we need. We have money, we reassured Karpovich and went shopping. Of course, we couldn't buy anything without grocery cards. In the store where donors were served, we persuaded the girls to let us have a few bottles of champagne. We are going to celebrate a meeting with a friend wounded at the front. You must understand us, we persuaded the sales clerks. We left the store with champagne, and we had to buy food at the market. For every kilogram of bread or meat, speculators were skinning us. So we left the money paid to us for several shot-down Junkers and Messerschmitts. After this campaign, the cheerful mood quickly faded away. For the first time, we saw how hard life was in the rear. We wanted to get to the place of our destination sooner, to get new airplanes and return to the front again, to destroy the hated enemy, who brought so much misfortune to our land. We had a friendly dinner in Karpovich's family. Wishing him a speedy recovery, we soon left for the airfield. A couple of days later, the regiment arrived. Our group was included in its composition. The squadron was given a shabby Zis to move to Baku. The pilots settled down in the back. The regiment commissar Mikhail Akimovich Pogrebnoy was appointed as our senior. This move to Baku almost ended tragically. After an overnight stay in Derbent, the way was diverted to the mountains, and from there we drove to the sea through a mountain pass. The driver had no practice of driving on mountain roads. Brakes malfunction also had an impact. The driver, not taking into account the terrain, accelerated the car and braked sharply at turns, switching the gearbox. 7 years of experience in driving a car alerted me. Such a trip in the mountains could lead to serious consequences. Being in the body, I carefully watched the actions of the driver through the rear window of the cabin. The car on the descent from the pass, going downhill, was gaining more and more speed. Ahead there was a mountain ledge and a turn to the right, and to the left a deep gorge with a river. The chauffeur began to hastily switch the gearbox lever to braking. He could not do anything. Then, throwing the lever, he clutched the steering wheel with both hands. The situation was catastrophic. We must leave the car immediately. Jump. Everybody jump immediately. I gave the command and threw myself on the slope. After me immediately left the body of the pilots, followed by Pogrebnoy and the driver. A dozen meters later, the car, overturning, flew into the gorge. All our things, barrels with fuel and apples bought in the mountains, fell into the abyss. Iskrin's harmonica, unbuttoned, made a pitiful parting sound and disappeared into the depths of the gorge. The rescue, the picture of the car overturning and falling into the abyss, the sound of the harmonica, caused quite an unexpected reaction in the pilots sitting on the road. Coughing and rubbing their bruised places, all of them suddenly laughed loudly. It was laughter through tears. Then they got up and began to help those who were more seriously injured. A passenger car came and took 3 of them with fractures and went down to the sea, to the hospital. From there a semi-truck was sent and took us to the doctors. We had to examine everyone, if there were no hidden injuries. There we spent the night. The next morning I went to visit the hospitalized. M.A. Pogrebnoy was lying with a bandaged chest. He had 2 broken ribs. A. Fedorov and V. Shulga were only slightly injured. Pogrebnoy was very happy to hear that everyone was alive. I came out of the hospital and saw a large representative man standing there. The figure seemed very familiar to me. When I came closer, I recognized Fediv. We embraced. We clapped each other's shoulders for a long time. Vadim. How did you end up here? Fate, Sasha. I was being treated after being wounded. Tomorrow I'm going to Baku, to some reserve regiment. You know what, Vadim? We're going to Baku for rearmament too. Join our regiment. We know you, you know our pilots. Otherwise you'll end up with someone you don't know. I agree. We'll fight together. You can be sure I won't let you down. I'll come to Baku and find your regiment. What's wrong with your arm? Why is it bandaged? I told Vadim about the accident on the road. We agreed how to find each other in Baku. Our unit was stationed in a reserve air regiment town near Baku. Having got acquainted with the situation, we realized that all plans about soon receiving planes and returning to the front had collapsed. The prospect was not happy. We had to wait for combat equipment. Ahead of us were several horseless regiments that had arrived here before us. They were alternately retrained from I-16 and Gulls to Yak-1. This forced and prolonged break from combat operations turned out to be full of dramatic and heavy experiences in my fate. While the commissar of the unit was on treatment, the leaders of the regiment, using their power, decided to recall old disputes and actually settle accounts. They withdrew the submission on me for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, took other measures. Soon they warned me in confidence. Alexander Ivanovich, a case has been opened against you on the charge of violating the guidelines and instructions for the actions of fighters. At the meeting you will confess your mistakes and promise not to allow it again. Then you'll get off with a reprimand. Or it could be worse. I don't think I'd repent for mistakes I didn't make. What kind of crime is that? I proceeded from the experience of combat operations, used myself and taught the pilots to fight tactically in a new way, not according to outdated pre-war documents. I will not refuse. I'm sure the communists of the regiment will support me. The message excited me. I had no one to turn to for help. Pogrebnoy was in the hospital, and the commanders who knew and respected me were at the front. The storm was thickening every day. I was informed that I, by the decision of Zayev and Vorontsov, without a meeting of the communists, was expelled from the party and removed from the regular staff of the regiment. I was depressed. Then I decided to pull myself together. I was confident that everything would fall into place. The most important thing now is to prepare for future battles. And I, going to the sea, began to think more deeply about the tactics of fighters. Reflecting on my combat experience and the experience of other pilots, I thought over new methods of fighter combat operations which would allow to destroy the enemy more effectively in the air and on the ground. Realizing that I had little time left, I decided to give up textual presentation and depicted tactical methods of searching for the enemy, building of combat orders of fighter groups, fighting graphically on schemes with brief explanations. Every day my album was filled. New tactical forms of combat were emerging, in the successful application of which I was confident. To tell the truth, sometimes I had doubts: why am I developing all this? Will I be able to use the results of my work in combat? But the consciousness that tactical developments will be useful to my friends, pilots of the squadron and regiment, helped to overcome heavy thoughts. However, there were reasons for doubts. The pilots of the squadron came to me on shore in the free evenings. We discussed tactical outlines. From them I also learned about affairs in the regiment. They reported that they had been questioned about my possible negative behavior in combat. The threat was growing more and more. But the impending events were abruptly stopped by higher command. Unexpectedly, the regiment was included in the fighter division, which arrived from the front for retraining and additional staffing. Our part was relocated by railroad transport to Makhachkala. They decided to leave me in the reserve regiment, but its commander allowed me to leave with my unit. The regiment was received by the division commander, who knew our pilots from the battles in Moldavia. He asked, "Where is your squadron commander Pokrishkin? Why is he not in the ranks?" He was expelled from the regiment and is under investigation for violating the instructions of the fighter aviation. I don't understand. I knew him as a real fighter pilot. This matter must be dealt with. Pokrishkin came with us, shouted one of the pilots standing in formation. "Find him and call him here," ordered the division commander. I was in the barracks at that time. The call acted like a stroke of thunder, everything. Now they will send back to the reserve regiment, I thought, going to introduce myself to the division commander. "Report, what have you done?" he asked me. I had done nothing criminal. The charge is undeserved. And about the reason, ask the commander of the regiment. "Come with me to the political department. There we'll sort it out," suggested the commissar of the division. He listened to me in detail, ordered me to put everything in an explanatory note. In the evening there was a party meeting of the regiment. The division commissar was present. The communists discussed the circumstances of the case and acquitted me, noting that the previous decision to dismiss me from my post was taken undeservedly, as well as the exclusion from party membership. A few days later, the commander of the Air Army, General N.F. Naumenko, personally talked to me. Having familiarized himself with the circumstances in which I found myself, he ordered to stop all business and appointed me deputy commander of the regiment. When I returned to the unit, I was summoned by Zayev. He said in a friendly tone, "You've been appointed my deputy. Start working on retraining the pilots of the regiment." "I can't be your deputy. Please appoint me commander of the squadron, which is now commanded by Fidjishev, and take him as your deputy. He became a hero of the Soviet Union. He's worthy of this position. I need to fly more and fight the Nazis." "That's the main thing for me now," I firmly stated. "Well, as you wish. If you decide so, I'll ask you to change the order. Let's forget all our troubles. Let's live by the proverb, he who remembers the old, to him the eye out, don't you agree? Injustice is not forgotten. Permission to go?" Now I was even more confident. I took over the squadron, eagerly plunged into teaching the pilots new tactics. Tactical classes were conducted according to my own developments. The actions of pilots in a combat flight practiced in advance with the use of model airplanes. For me, it was a hot, fruitful period. I was surrounded by loyal friends Fadiv, Fedorov, Iskrin. I had a direct opportunity with my like-minded people to practice many ideas, to sharpen and polish tactical techniques, to experiment boldly, first on the ground, and then in the air. All thoughts were aimed at one thing: to prepare the squadron for the coming battles. We avidly followed the messages from the front, both in the press and in official documents. We discussed the actions of fighters, the tactics of Hitler's aces. When I learned that our industry began to produce fighters with onboard radios, I decided not to wait for special instructions. I gathered the pilots and said that we would start preparing for it immediately. The front does not give time. I studied the documents, began to hold classes. Much attention was paid to practicing radio exchange in flight. All unnecessary clogging the airwaves conversations, information in the orders of group commanders resolutely excluded. Achieved a short and clear radio exchange. The pilots were taught that every unnecessary word on the radio takes away valuable time from the actions in combat and can lead to unjustified death. In training flights, he paid much attention to mastering the piloting of the airplane in complicated conditions. Using being in the seaside mountainous area, he took young pilots on the Yak-7 training aircraft to practice flying in the gorges between the mountains, mastered shaving flight over the Caspian Sea, taught them to pilot the aircraft boldly at low altitude. Training flights from early morning to late evening, constant communication with the flight crew distracted from heavy memories, drowned out the bitterness of resentment. Personal experiences in that difficult period pale before the events that were taking shape at the front. The enemy persistently rushed to the oil fields of Grozny and Baku, seeking to seize them and deprive our army and country of oil. In this, Hitler's command saw the possibility of victory. However, the plans of fascists were not justified. A great joy for us was the message about the disruption of the enemy offensive on Grozny in late October, as well as the defeat of the tank group near Ordzhonikidze in early November. We listened to this information, especially about the successful actions of the aviation of our air army, and envied those who distinguished themselves in these battles, and lamented our prolonged stay in the rear. Immense jubilation in the personnel of the regiment caused the message about the successful encirclement of the Nazi armies near Stalingrad, rapid offensive actions of our fronts, and successful destruction of the encircled enemy troops near the Volga River strengthened the faith in the imminent defeat of the enemy, in our victory. The pilots of the regiment did their best to speed up the mastering of the Yak-1, to go to the front faster, and to personally participate in battles with the enemy. In these days of joyful events at the fronts, and not yet forgotten experiences, I had a meeting with a girl, came true love. She turned my views on the influence of family in the formation of a pilot, and on his abilities in battles with the enemy. I will not hide, I used to think that during the war a pilot could not have a so-called personal life. Mutual desire for meetings after flights and battles with Masha, a paramedic from the Sanbat, became stronger and stronger. Vadim Fedev could not help noticing the seriousness of our relationship. One day he and I had a serious conversation. "Sasha, have you decided to start a family?" "Yes, Vadim. Masha and I have real feelings for each other, and we want to be together for life." "When is the wedding?" "Make up your mind. As your friend, I'll try to help organize it." "Don't be in a hurry. We need time to test the seriousness of our feelings, our mutual fidelity." "Did you ever think you might die and leave her a widow?" "No, Vadim. I'm more confident now than ever in my combat experience. It's not easy to bring me down. Speaking of which, I believe in myself. More than 400 combat sorties, about 12 counted and a few uncounted shot down enemy planes taught to fight. Of course, war is war. It is possible to die. Maria and I had few happy days. Their battalion was urgently sent to another front, near Milarovo. We had time only to say goodbye and agreed to wait for each other. We were not detained near Makhachkala either. We were transferred to a reserve regiment based west of Baku. We were to be rearmed on American P-39 Airacobra fighters, received under the Lend-Lease through Iran. After arriving at the 3rd Reserve Air Regiment, having placed the squadron in the dormitory, I went to the airfield to look at the new material part. At the aircraft parking lot, I saw Lieutenant Colonel Dusasov. "What, you came to see the American equipment?" "That's right, Comrade Regiment Commander. We've been ordered to retrain for the Airacobra." "So you'll replace us. We've already finished ramming and tomorrow we'll leave for Kuban." "How are the Aircobra's standing fighters?" I asked Zusov. "The airplane is good. In speed is not inferior to the Messerschmitts and has a strong armament. You can fight on it. Ibrahim Magometovich pleased me. Go to my plane and get acquainted with it." Airacobra, I liked its shape and, mainly, powerful armament. There was something to shoot down enemy planes, a cannon caliber of 37mm, 2 large caliber rapid-fire machine guns, and 4 machine guns of normal caliber at 1,000 rounds per minute each. My mood was not spoiled, and after warning pilots about the dangerous feature of the plane to corkscrew because of the rear alignment, I had to see this drawback with my own eyes the next day. Before leaving for the front, the regiment navigator was performing a complex aerobatics at low altitude. The airplane suddenly went into a corkscrew. There was not enough altitude for withdrawal, and the Airacobra crashed into the ground. Looking at the smoking crater in which the wreckage of the airplane was burning, I thought that the Airacobra does not forgive mistakes in piloting. This disaster confirmed the opinion of American pilots. They were afraid of the Airacobra and were reluctant to fight on it. Thinking about it, I decided to thoroughly study the features of the fighter and remove the fears of me and the pilots of our unit. On this airplane we will have to fight, and distrust of combat equipment reduces activity, can lead to unnecessary losses. In a short period of time, the pilots studied the equipment. Then we began to fly. I, who had previously flown on such austere airplanes, such as I-16 and MiG-3, retraining for Airacobra did not cause much difficulty. I quickly mastered piloting the airplane at the limit of its capabilities. Soon I felt that this fighter became a part of my body and my flying mind. I instilled confidence in the pilots of the squadron in piloting the airplane, removing from them the obsessive fear left from the crash of the navigator of the Dusovsky Regiment. In training, flights achieved in pilots high coordination of movements of the rudders of the aircraft. And this is one of the guarantees against straying into a corkscrew. Vigorous aerobatics, flights in difficult meteorological conditions became mandatory, and flight training he taught what was necessary in combat conditions. Firm, iron consistency, gradual complication of programs ensured retraining without flying accidents. Soon we were fully prepared for combat operations. The pilots of the unit had transported vehicles for the regiment from Iran. A new phase in the regiment's combat operations was beginning. The flying staff was highly prepared in moral and psychological terms. Boundless patriotism, readiness to defend their socialist fatherland were combined with full mastery of the combat aircraft, the ability to use all its piloting and firing capabilities to the limit. In these days, I often mentally returned to the difficult weeks of the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. In the 41st year, we did not have time to retrain on the MiG-3. We mastered it during the battles. We paid for it with blood. Many battle friends died in the fierce battles. Now it's different. Confidence in mastering the combat aircraft was supplemented by knowledge of the perfect tactics of fighters. Pilots have mastered the techniques of modern combat, developed on the experience of past battles. The flying staff physically rested, strengthened, and was ready for battles in the sky. I regretted only that I did not have to conduct training fights with pilots on other types of fighters. This would have allowed me to practically test the combat qualities of my airplane and the combat techniques I had developed. However, such a case soon presented itself. On the eve of our flight to the front, we were ordered to fly to Tbilisi on my plane, and pilot Sapochnikov from a neighbouring regiment on a Spitfire. At the airfield, we were approached by a car. A large man in a leather raglan got out of it. "I am the director of the aircraft factory," he introduced himself. "You have been summoned here for demonstration airfights with a new fighter, a lightweight Lag-3. We believe that these machines are not worse, but better than many foreign ones. Soon the aviation command of the front and the Black Sea Air Force will arrive, and we will start flying." "And what exactly should we do?" I asked the director. "You will fly out in pairs with Lagami and conduct a training air combat. On the order of sorties, you will be instructed by the head of the test flight group of the plant." The director left. We lay down under the wing of the war machine, involuntarily listened to the conversations of technicians. They were refueling our planes. "Now the test pilots will show how to fight," we heard. "Sasha, do you hear what the technicians predict for us?" broke the silence Sapochnikov. "I hear. It already concerns US personally. It's a pity to disgrace Lager, but we will have to show what air combat is and how to fight." At that time, 2 Lagers, our opponents, landed. We worked out the flight task and waited for the flight. The conditions of the battle were not easy. Our opponents had to go with Sapochnikov and me on a bearing as wingmen. Thus, even before the start of the battle on the turns, they had favourable positions. But the owners decided so, and we did not argue. The way out had to look for in the course of the battle. The leadership came. I took off in the first pair, gained the set altitude, and wiggling wings gave the command to start the battle on horizontal manoeuvres. I energetically brought my plane into a turn and, having let the lag at a safe distance, made a sudden barrel roll with a descent. The Lag-3 sped over me. I immediately got on his tail and took him in my sights. No matter how much the lag spun, I did not let it out of my sight. Several minutes passed. The result was obvious. Let's see how the enemy will behave on verticals. Threw my airplane into a steep dive and, accelerating speed, went into a slide. At the top point, put the plane on the wing. Lug was going below in a combat turn. I did not have much trouble to get into his tail and put him in the scope, parrying all attempts of the enemy to get out from under the blow. Sapochnikov also won the battle on turns. On vertical maneuvers, the fight in his pair was on equal terms. At high-speed flight over the airfield, after acceleration on dive, the Lag-3 went uninterruptedly next to me, and the Spitfire, having worse dive properties, significantly lagged behind us. The bosses left. The director of the plant left after him. Everything didn't go the way he planned. The director did not even thank us for our labour. Only the plant engineer came over. He was obviously upset. "Well, engineer, are you sad? And on a good airplane you should be able to fight." I tried to calm him down. "Your Lug is not a bad airplane, but its armament is a little weak." "That's all right. We are now starting production of a new airplane, the La-5. We're putting in a powerful star-shaped engine and 2 cannons. It will prove itself in battle. God willing, we'll have something to fight the Messers with. Let's get it to the troops." I had to hear reviews and fly Lag-3s and La-5s myself. In battles they showed themselves quite well. In many qualities, La-5 surpassed the best Hitler's machines. but the pilot's training meant a lot. You can lose a battle, even with good equipment. I think that the show fight did not give an opportunity to reveal all the qualities of the fighter. At the helm sat pilots with far from equal performance, test pilots and frontline pilots with combat experience. The range of their training was far from identical. But this training battle confirmed our readiness for the upcoming meetings with the real enemy. The retreating 17th German Army and part of the formations of the once formidable 1st Tank Army did not have time to break through Rostov to the west and withdrew to the Taman Peninsula. Here they entrenched themselves. The place was convenient. The flooded Kuban and insurmountable Plavny, overgrown with reeds, with numerous swamps of the Kuban-Priazov lowland, the Black Sea created a natural barrier in front of the Taman bridgehead. The enemy here created a deep defensive strip developed in engineering terms, called the Blue Line. Hitlerites aspired to keep the Taman bridgehead, expecting to use it for a new offensive to the Caucasus, and also with the purpose to prevent the Soviet troops from reaching the Crimea. The lull in fighting in the spring of 1943 allowed the enemy to concentrate in the Crimea and on the Taman Peninsula a powerful grouping of aviation. Our aviation in this area had in service about 600 airplanes. At the same time, a significant part of them were obsolete types. Strengthening of our aviation grouping was delayed, slowly drying ground airfields. According to the plan of concentration, one of the first transferred to the Kuban and our regiment. We had already finished retraining on new equipment and were ready for combat operations. High moral, political, tactical and technical training of the flying staff, no doubt, provided successful actions in a difficult air situation. Pilots and technicians realized that the upcoming air battle will require from everyone a huge amount of tension, determination, courage, and were ready for new hot battles. Those who had experienced the severity of the retreat were preparing for them with special impatience. For almost 2 years we left our airfields with bitterness in our souls and flew to other airfields located to the east. Now we are going west. Squadron in pairs quickly took off from the intermediate airfield and built right bearing, with an excess of pairs of airplanes between each other. Formed a combat order stagecoach. We got on course and went in a southerly direction to the new airfield. Soon the Black Sea appeared on the horizon ahead. Above the coast we turned along the coast to the northwest. To the left, boundless and desolate blue water. Only near the shore small ships are visible. They are clearly visible by the white stormy trail. On the right side of the route is the main Caucasus Ridge. The snowy peaks glisten under the sun rays, and Elbrus rises majestically among them. The Caucasus Mountains reminded me of the battles of last summer. Then the regiment acted against the troops of the 1st and 4th Tank Armies, advancing on Stalingrad and Grozny. Then I remembered the heavy battles in the skies of Moldova and Ukraine. It was a terrible time. There was not enough airplanes, especially new ones, and there was no combat experience. Retreat, death of friends in heavy battles with strong and experienced enemy oppressed us, caused hatred to fascist invaders. At that time, rarely any of the combat pilots believed that they would reach the end of the war, but everyone was firmly convinced of our victory over fascism. The group approached the area where the possible appearance of the enemy, with memories had to end, to focus on the search for the air enemy. Inspecting my sector, I periodically reviewed the entire airspace around our squadron. I was glad that the combat order in the group is clearly maintained. How much labor is invested in training pilots in the new tactics, how much trouble I had in the fight with those who sought to prepare air fighters in the old way. Here is a paradox: the one who personally did not fly on combat missions demanded to strictly follow outdated instructions. Now all this is behind us. We will fight as modern combat requires. We are ready for it. I was sure that the enemy will experience the power of our strikes. I was convinced that the new tactical methods, new forms of building combat orders will be justified in air battles. I was also confident in my combat friends. Some have already been tested in battles, others are reliably prepared for them, raring to go on missions. They passed on the experience of fighters matured in battle. They should not feel helpless novices, seeing the enemy planes. Lead them into battle-experienced frontline pilots. One thing bothered me. Doubt caused doubt appointed. Despite my objections, Deputy Squadron Commander Captain Paskiv. From the very beginning of the war, he showed fearfulness in combat. In the North Caucasus, when the group assaulting a convoy his plane was set on fire by anti-aircraft guns, the pilot received minor burns, but successfully ejected with a parachute. It seemed to me that in this battle he suffered a severe mental trauma. Failure had broken him. Apparently, the instinct of self-preservation overpowered the pilot, and he could not control himself when meeting the enemy. It was a serious flaw. He threatened not only him. After all, the deputy squadron commander has to drive groups on combat missions. I did not have strong faith in this officer. Behind remained hidden by haze snowy peaks of the Caucasus. Now on the right, going down to the west, there were forested spurs of the ridge. Below us was Tuapse, the turning point of our route. Now the course to the north, to Krasnodar. Halfway from Tuapse to Krasnodar, I became anxious. It seemed that we were flying to the shore of the Sea of Azov. Once again I checked our course by landmarks on the left and right. We are going correctly. I looked around and realized that the spring floods of the Kuban and its numerous plavni. There was so much water that it could be mistaken for a bay of the Sea of Azov. We are approaching Krasnodar. Here is the airfield. I give target instructions by a new method, mastered by all pilots of the regiment. I am Pokrishkin, 11 o'clock, below 30 degrees the airfield. Throwing a glance in the direction indicated, the pilots of the squadron will instantly see the place of landing. This method of target designation was practiced to gain time to orient the pilots in the group. Upon hearing the data, pilots did not search for a target in a wide sector of airspace, but immediately directed their eyes in the indicated sector. This is important in aerial combat. The one who detects the enemy earlier has a better chance of victory. And the essence of the method is that the location of the target is indicated by an imaginary clock face, 0 and 12 along the longitudinal axis of the airplane forward, orientation on the vertical in degrees of angle below or above the horizon. After landing, we could hardly find places to park the airplanes. All concrete pockets were occupied, and it was still impossible to land on the ground. The mud sucked the wheels. The situation at the airfield was difficult. A large number of airplanes were concentrated, and in case of a raid, there could be heavy losses. I went to the command post, believing that the regiment commander Zayev was there, but met Pogrebnoy. "Comrade Commissar," I reported to him, "the squadron made the flight without incident. Where can I find the regiment commander?" "Wait for now. Now the others will land, then you'll report. There's such a cluster of regiments here." "Yes, this is the first time I've seen such a concentration of our planes. If the Germans hit the airfield, there'll be a lot of wood. The regiment must get out of here to another airfield." I told Pogrebnoy about it. "The airfields have thinned out. We'll have to work from here for a few days." The second squadron, commanded by Captain Teterin, has landed. The third squadron was still not, although by time it should have arrived. Came the regiment commander. I reported that everything was in order in our squadron. "What kind of order?" "Your friend Fadiev apparently got lost and his whole squadron landed somewhere unknown." "What do you mean, the guard?" Zayev said unhappily. "Everything is clear, comrade commander," I explained. "They were confused by the spring flooding of the Kuban. They apparently mistook it for the Gulf of Azov, took the right and skipped Krasnodar. I'll beat them up, the rascals. And your friend, and especially Krukov, the regiment navigator, is flying and got lost. Ivanov left this promiscuity in the regiment. They're not guardsmen." The reproach angered me, and I couldn't resist, I said. The whole regiment flew over. Apparently the commander should have led it. Then everyone would have arrived at the landing point. "Don't be in the habit of telling your superiors what to do. Apparently you didn't get enough last year," Zayev said in a fever and ducked into the command post dugout. We had nothing to do but to go with Pogrebny to the room allotted to us. On the way, the commissar reproached me. "Why do you get into an argument with your elders? It only hurts you. It's a shame when people talk about Viktor Petrovich like that. The combat pilots loved him. He was a real commander. I strongly advise you, Alexander Ivanovich, to hold back and stay out of the argument. All right, I'll try. I said that, but I thought about the fact that I would not forget the injustice to me. I would not be able to erase it in my memory. The regiment's personnel were stationed in the ruins of the warehouse. Here were built in the full length of the bunks. On them were mattresses and pillows stuffed with straw. Here, make yourselves comfortable. We will live until we are relocated to the airfield assigned to our regiment in Popovicheskaya village, said Pogrebnoy. The pilots got used to different conditions. Immediately looked around the room. Our commander likes to fly at altitude. That's why we occupy the top tier, said the commander of the Link N, Normenko, and threw his things upstairs. He was followed by the rest. Combat sorties were not expected. Asked Pogrebego permission to go to Krasnodar, where I had not been for 5 years. Soon I went by car to the places I knew. Beautiful. Like most southern cities, Krasnodar now lay in ruins. The enemy, retreating, burned and blew up many buildings. I stopped by the Osovia Chimera Club, or rather, the former flying field on the outskirts of the city. Here I learned to fly the U-2 and became a pilot. I was so eager for the sky that I refused even to study at the Zhukovsky Academy. In 17 days I finished the program of the Aero Club, passed the exams with honours, and was sent to the Kachinsky School of Pilots. On the site of the Aero Club, now we could see piles of broken bricks. It was clear that the building had been blown up by the Nazis. Nothing. We will repay them for the flying club and for all the atrocities they committed on our land. By evening in the dormitory was assembled flying staff of the regiment to study the combat situation. Fadiev's squadron was absent. Justified my assumptions. Taking the flood of the Kuban River, approaching Krasnodar from the west, for the Bay of the Sea of Azov, leading Pavel Kryukov changed course and took his group to the right. The planes landed forcibly on an empty dirt airfield near Tikhoritsk. Landing on the last litres of gasoline was organised, without breakdowns. Gasoline trucks were sent there, and in the morning the pilots should return to the regiment. Having learned that the battle comrades have everything in order, we breathed a sigh of relief. In the dormitory arrived the head of Intelligence Division Captain Novitsky, and well-known at that time pilots of the 45th and 298th Fighter Aviation Regiments, part of our division. We met them as old friends from joint combat operations. We listened with great interest. They had already in February and March fought with enemy aircraft over the Blue Line and could pass on much of their experience. And there was a lot to learn from them. Captain Novitsky informed us about the current situation in the area of the Taman Peninsula. Reports about the enemy and our aviation caused anxiety among the flying staff. And in fact there was a reason. According to intelligence and captured German pilots, against us operates 4th Air Fleet of the Germans, which has up to 1,000 airplanes, said the head of intelligence. In addition, attracted to strike at our advancing troops bombing squadrons from airfields in Ukraine. This is more than 200 bombers. Fighter aviation consists of the most select squadrons on new fighters Mi-109G2 and Mi-109G4. They have a flight speed of over 600 kilometers per hour and are armed with 2 and 3 guns, in addition to machine guns. Tell me, Comrade Captain, what are our forces opposing this air grouping of the Germans? Asked the commander of the 2nd Squadron, Teterin. Our aviation in the 4th and 5th Air Armies, the Black Sea Fleet Air Force has more than 600 aircraft of different types. As you can see, the balance of power on the side of the Germans. Everyone was silent, thinking about what could be waiting for us in battles with such a strong enemy. Comrade Captain. I could not resist, although I knew that he will not solve this problem. You reported a powerful air group of the enemy. And we, having less than 1,000 airplanes, divided them into 3 aviation associations. Is that correct? It's a small area of the front. I cannot answer this question. The operational structure of our aviation in the Kuban so far. However, its actions are coordinated by the Air Force Command of the front. It coordinated before, since the beginning of the war. We were beaten in pieces and chased to the Volga. Then we wised up and created air armies. And here, in the Kuban, what? A repetition of the past. There are a lot of headquarters, but not enough airplanes. Pokrishkin, stop it, Zayev interrupted me. Sit down. I realized that it was useless to argue, and there was something to argue about. When will they stop using aviation dispersed? I was glad that when Alexander Alexandrovich Novikov came to the leadership of aviation in the Air Force, were created armies subordinate only to the front. The formation of air associations justified itself in the battles for Stalingrad and in the offensives of the fronts this year. And here. It will be difficult. Again, we will have to fight with spread fingers, and we need a fist. Skill and courage of pilots will not do everything. The mood of the flying staff of the regiment was raised by the stories of pilots who had already participated in the battles in the Kuban. Boris Glinka analyzed in detail one of these fights. Early in the morning in mid-March, he led a group to cover the battlefield. They flew on Cobras. At the approach to the front line met going to the East 12 bombers, there were no fighters to cover. With a blow from above, the whole group ours immediately shot down 3 planes. The rest of the bombers, having dropped bombs in the field, disorganized, began to turn around, trying to go west. There followed a new attack of our fighters already on the upset battle order. And again down went the burning bombers. The group shot down 8 bombers in this battle, without suffering losses. Boris was silent, interrupted Glinka's speech regimental navigator Mikhail Petrov that in this battle he himself was especially distinguished. He shot down 2 bombers. The second plane from his volley broke in half. He shot at point-blank range. Then Petrov told about a heavy battle in which up to 10 enemy planes were shot down, but also the 8 which he commanded lost 3 pilots. The group began the battle with a 4 Mi-109s. Soon they were attacked from above by 8 Messerschmitts. Petrov's wingman was shot down, and in a few minutes a burning torch went to the ground and Mi-109. Another 8 Messerschmitts came to the aid of the enemy. It collapsed with a move on our 7. The second Mi-109 caught fire, and then Boris Glinka's voice was heard on the radio. Wounded. I'm out of the battle. Later we learned that a shell hit the cockpit of his plane. He didn't obey the rudders well. Trying to finish him, 4 Messerschmitts rushed to the damaged plane. However, Boris's wingman, Sergeant Kudryashov, repulsed this onslaught. Then Hitlerites switched to Kudryashov and set him on fire. Having reported on the radio that he was on fire, Kudryashov directed his burning plane at the Mi-109 and crashed into it. The fiery explosion of the 2 planes stunned the enemy for a while. Then the enemy pilot started attacks again. Shmatko's plane caught fire. He repeated the actions of Kudryashov, crashed into the Messerschmitt. This second ram so affected the Nazis that they, although they had absolute superiority in strength, stopped the fight. Several other pilots spoke at the class. They set the officers of the regiment on a fighting mood, wanted to sooner meet with enemy aircraft in the air, themselves to crush the invaders. Having studied the air situation in the Kuban, they began to prepare the overflight of the front line. The next day, squadrons of 14 planes were to fly along the front line to familiarize themselves with the terrain, the front line. The groups were headed by the best commanders of the 45th Regiment. Realizing that the flight in such a composition is dangerous, I expressed my opinion to the regiment commander. You can't fly with such a large group. Combat experience shows that a group with more than 8 aircraft becomes unmaneuverable. 14 airplanes will turn out to be a swarm, not a formation. Sudden attack a couple of Messerschmitt will inevitably lead to casualties. Apparently, my reasoning seemed worthless to the commander. Comrade Pokrishkin, your business is to listen and write down instructions, not to express an opinion. When you become a regiment commander, then you will give your suggestions. And now don't interfere. It was useless to defend his opinion. Zayev did not like to consult with squadron commanders. There was a legitimate question: how did such officers get to such high positions? The question is simple only at first glance. In fact, to answer it is full of very difficult. There were shortcomings in the study of personnel. For example, this officer was a navigator. He coped with his duties. Outwardly businesslike. With the leadership is malleable. Fulfills instructions. He knows the equipment, the people. makes judgments that are not objectionable. What's not a regimental commander? His shortcomings are not visible to his seniors. How does he rely on experienced pilots? Does he consult with the commissars or with his deputies? Is he able to draw the right conclusion from the real combat situation in a critical situation? Does he have the courage to take responsibility for the introduction of a new maneuver, combat formation? To recognize these qualities, you need time. In a combat situation, it was not enough. It was necessary to study people by manifestation in battle, and the process of nomination of personnel still gravitated to the previous standards. It was later that they began to put a commander, smart and brave, who had gained experience of leadership in battle, to the regiment. And in the first months of the war, more looked at the service. But it must be said that weak commanders did not last long. The war quickly exposed them. Therefore, we see that some moved forward rapidly. They were trusted in regiments, divisions and corps, and others went to positions that did not require independent decisions. The battle selected the best. In the battle cognized and formed not only the character of the warrior, but also the commander and leader. In the morning, when the combat order of the group was determined and we were about to get into the airplanes, a passenger car drove up. Divisional Staff Officer handed Zayev. Overflight of the front edge of the front is cancelled. It is ordered to allocate a group of fighters and send it to the area of the village Krimskaya. The flight is immediate. The approach of enemy bombers to this area is expected. The group will receive specific instructions by radio from the Forward Control Center Tiger. I can't hide, I was immediately relieved, although I realized that it was extremely necessary to study the area. Comrade Regimental Commander, allow me to fly 8, I asked. I think 6 airplanes will be enough. Fly out. In the 6 I included my permanent link and a pair led by the link commander Rekolov, briefly instructed on the construction of the combat order of the group in the search for the enemy and the actions in battle. All clear. Good. On the planes? Yes. I heard a cheerful reply. Fly a course to the village of Krimskaya. It is located on the edge of the main blow of the North Caucasus front and is now turned into the main node of the enemy's defense on the Blue Line. Through it pass the main railroad and dirt highways to Novorossiysk, Taman and Temryuk. Hitlerites realize that with the capture of this node by our troops they cannot hold the Taman Peninsula. In the air I involuntarily remembered these places, Krimskaya, drowning in gardens, field airfield on its northern outskirts. 3 years in a row in the summer a separate Krasnodar aviation detachment camped there. From morning till evening there were flights to practice combat training tasks. I, then a senior aviation technician of the detachment, had enough work. I used my free evening time for quail hunting. I wandered through mown fields, picked up quail and shot them dead. The first hunting trips with Malapulka caused mockery of pilots and technicians. However, witticisms against me soon stopped. I returned with trophies, 5 or 6 quail hanging from my belt. Of course, I was not so much interested in quail as in my desire to learn how to shoot at a fast-flying small target. And on some days, doing Komsomol workload, led classes gliding circle cannery. Now Krimskaya is on the way of offensive of front troops. It will surely be hit by a powerful blow. What will become of this beautiful big village? We are flying, and soon I will see Krimskaya again and fight for it. To our right is the fast-flowing Kuban River. Becoming wider and calmer, in the distance it has spilled over its swamps and channels. The solid sea of water glistens under the rays of the morning sun. To the left of our route we could see the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. The villages were in white and pink colours from blossoming apple, almond and cherry trees. Nature was calling to joy, and we were flying to enter the deadly battle with the enemy. Maybe some of us see this beauty of spring for the last time. As we approached the front line, I radioed the command post. Tiger, I'm Pokrishkin. I'm going to work. Report the air situation. The air is calm. Stay above Krimskaya and wait for instructions, followed the command. The outdated method of patrolling in a large circle over the object of cover, I was not satisfied. I took the direction to the south, to the Black Sea, continuing to gain altitude. We need it very much to fulfill our planned patrolling by a new method speed-height. Above Novorossiysk on my command, the group turned to the right and took the direction to the village Krimskaya. The pairs on the turn quickly reorganized and took their places in the combat order. Now they were to my right, on the sunny side. I moved the group into a gentle descent. The gained altitude allowed to accelerate the machines, to reach high speed. That's the point of the maneuver. We ensured the suddenness of appearance over the area of cover, the swiftness of the strike on the air enemy, if he appears. If necessary, at the expense of accelerated at a reduced speed, we could quickly seize superiority and in height. And whoever is higher is the master in the air. This was our new method of patrolling on the principle of the movement of the clock pendulum. It was tactically advantageous and prevented economical fuel consumption in flight. At high speed, the group was going to the village in a gentle descent. I, the leader of the group, had the engine working in the mode below maximum. The wingman, having a reserve of engine power easily kept in the combat order of the stagecoach, under a US Crimean. In the air there are no enemy aircraft. Below us patrolled the link lag. They went over the area in a large circle, at low speed, periodically putting the tails of their aircraft under the sun. And this is the most dangerous position for surprise attacks by enemy fighters. Watching them from above, involuntarily thought that before that, and in our regiment so patrolled, they were doing a merry-go-round over the object. When we met with enemy fighters, it put us in a disadvantageous defensive position. But someone approved this form of maneuver, wrote the instructions. In order to save fuel consumption, to achieve the duration of patrolling, the speeds corresponding to the economic mode of engine operation were set. It was prescribed to patrol precisely over the object of cover, so we were flying at low speed, buzzing like mosquitoes. From below, from the ground, of course, created the appearance of cover, but in fact the fighters were in the most disadvantageous position. This has to end. We're using as much fuel now as before. But we're flying meteors over the protected object. We're ready to attack, not defend. Yes, it's no fun for a group of lugs to get pelted by Messerschmitts. Unfortunately, not all regiments are still using the new techniques. Even in our unit, we are just mastering them. Not flying to the Cuban River, gained speed due to the previous acceleration and went to altitude. We turned to the left, towards the west. The group again descended, increasing speed, went to Krimskaya, as if scouring the air over the front line. Our method of pendulum flight during patrolling and the combat order Itagarika held in this flight the first test. The combat order of the group, with pairs dispersed in front and altitude, was similar to the steps of a porch going away from the leading pair to the side and upwards. This formation of the group provided a large space to search for the target. At the same time, it made it difficult for the enemy to detect the group. This connection of pairs along the front and height did not restrain pilots, prevented from collision in the air aircraft, at the same time allowed to pay more attention to the circular search. Now it was not necessary for each pilot to constantly monitor the rear hemisphere. Mutual search of pairs allowed at a great distance to detect the enemy and prevent attacks from the rear hemisphere. Or the maneuverability of pairs and the entire group was as high as that of a single aircraft, and this is very important for the swiftness of execution of attacks by our fighters and disruption of enemy attacks. In general, both I and my combat friends were eager to meet the enemy. It was necessary to test our tactical ideas by combat. Here we are again over Krimskaya. But the situation there is already different. A large group of Mi-109G Pect 4 Lag 3s, which stood in a defensive circle. This dozen messers are probably sent for cleaning. Its task is to drive away our fighters, to free the sky for bombers. I'm Pokrishkin. 11 o'clock, below 30 degrees messers. Attack. Cover. I bring the plane into dive and make a falcon strike on the leading one. At high speed I shoot at point-blank range. First smoke, and then fire came out of the messer. I almost crashed into this burning torch. I jerked the control stick to myself and went sharply upwards. From a large overload darkened in the eyes. I came to my senses. Looked around. The upper pair lit up the second Mi-109G at the attempt of the enemy group to go up. The plane shot down by Rekulov completely demoralized the remaining 8. Steeply diving to the ground, they were rushing in the western direction with smoke from engine afterburner. We did not pursue. Our task was to intercept the bombers. We were eager for the appearance of junkers to test new tactics and powerful armament of airplanes. About an hour scoured the front edge of the defense, patrolling pendulum method. Bombers and fighters in the air did not appear. Apparently, our sudden strike on the group of cleaning confused the maps of the fascists. They refused to make a bombing strike. Fuel was coming to an end, and we took a course to Krasnodar. When returning, without distracting from the observation of airspace, once again mentally replayed the dynamics of our combat sortie, thought about whether it corresponded to our developments. Now in practice, in combat conditions, tested everything that we thought and worked on during our retraining on the new material part. These forms were not born by chance. We realized that it was impossible to fight the way we had fought in the sky in the past. Analyzing my combat experience and the experience of other pilots for 2 years of war, came to the conclusion that we often acted tactically illiterate, and this led to unnecessary losses. The feat required a combination of courage and thought, skill and search. Reflections, advice from pilots with extensive combat experience, in-depth study of the combat capabilities of aircraft allowed us to develop these new tactical methods of combat operations, to discard in the tactics of all that prevented confidently defeat the enemy. Album with schemes and calculations, models of aircraft became teaching aids for tactical training of pilots' first squadron, and then the regiment. Vadim Fadiv made a very great contribution to the work on improving fighter tactics and its implementation in training. This infinitely brave man, of great height and athletic build, with the character of Olga Rebel, enthusiastically perceived everything new in tactical techniques and actively implemented them in training. Today our quest has passed the first examination. True, in this combat sortie not everything could not be checked practically, what was conceived, drawn in the schemes of the album. Some of the developed provisions of high-speed patrolling, the construction of etagerie, and search for the enemy has not yet fully satisfied me. It was necessary to finalize the methods of patrolling and searching for the enemy at different positions of the sun relative to the front line, on probable routes of enemy aircraft approach. I realized that all this would still have to be thought over and worked out on the ground. The group approached the airfield. As it was established, the upper pair covered the landing of my link from possible attacks of enemy fighters. We landed safely. Immediately went to the command post to report on the fulfillment of the combat mission. Suddenly I heard Fadiv's voice behind me. "Sasha, have you distinguished yourself and stopped noticing your friends? I congratulate you on your first victory in the Kuban." Bormann from the control center reported the battle and confirmed that 2 messers were shot down. "Adim. Who do you take me for? It's not in my character to be a soapus. I'm glad everything went well with you. Yesterday everyone was worried. Especially for you. I know you're glad. But Krukov and I got a kick out of the commander. Vadim and I got to talking. I didn't notice how the pilots from the lags that we met over Krimskaya came up. Thank you, Captain, for your help. If it wasn't for your group, the bastards would have shot us down. They might have. You patrol the old-fashioned way. You're spinning at low speed, exposing yourself to the messer's tracks. If you keep flying like that, they'll shoot you down like partridges. We must patrol at speed and not hang around in the same neighborhood. Vadim, tell them about our pendulum method and the etagerie. I'll go report the flight. I wanted to go, but then Kryukov joined our group. He warmly shook my hand. The commander said he was pleased with your work. You started well. Well, and we gave a blow, he said with regret. An hour later summarized the results of the flight in the group. All were pleased with the results of the battle. True, the pilots of the middle pair a little slowed down before the flight of Messerschmitts from the battlefield. It would have been possible to shoot down more, but, as they say, the first pancake. Nothing, in the first battle there are worse mistakes. Otherwise everyone acted correctly. After the report, having gathered the pilots of the regiment, except for the 2nd Squadron, which was preparing to overflight the front line, I made a thorough review of the combat sortie of our six, shared my thoughts on patrolling and building a combat order. I recommended to the flying staff to change courses of pendulum patrolling from parallel to the front line to perpendicular, depending on the position of the sun. The sun should always be on the side of the group. The combat order of the stagecoach advised to build a ledge from the leading pair in the opposite direction from the sun, so that it did not interfere with the lower pairs to conduct observation. The angle of sighting between pairs should be from 30 to 45 degrees. It was more comfortable for the pilots to observe each other. They did not have to twist their necks. Everything was reduced to the fact that the pilots did not get too tired during the search for the enemy, were, as sportsmen say, always in shape. In such a formation of the combat order, the intervals between pairs should be greater than the excess. Today in the battle, the middle pair of our group during the search for the enemy kept a large angle of sighting. This is a mistake. It led to the fact that the pilots were overstressed before the battle, and later acted sluggishly when attacking Messerschmitts. After sorting out the pilots of the unit were preparing for the next combat sortie, the second squadron was leaving for the overflight of the front line. With difficulty built in a dense combat order of 14 aircraft, Fadeve stood next to me, watching the gathering in the group. He could not resist an exclamation. "Sasha, look what they are doing. How many airplanes in one group? They will collide with each other in such a tight formation." "It's not so terrible, Vadim. If they meet the Messers, we'll lose someone today." I was against these overflights, but I couldn't convince the commander. The squadron returned without one airplane. Over the front line, the formation was attacked by only one pair of Mi-109G. Jumping out of the clouds, Messers gave a turn and shot down one plane. Having done their job, they dived into the clouds and disappeared. Fortunately, the pilot managed to descend by parachute, but the regiment lost a fighting machine. The pilots of the squadron were discouraged by this incident. They could be understood 14 against 2 and lose an airplane. After this failure, Zayev cancelled the overflight of the frontline squadron, Fadeve. Apparently, Vadim's conversation with him had an impact. The pilots were happy with this decision. Flying 6 and 4 to cover our troops preparing for the offensive. The enemy aircraft did not show activity. In the air met only pairs and fours of fighter hunters. They were looking out from high-altitude loners. Our groups tried to attack them, but the enemy avoided open combat. Especially after one pair of Messerschmitts, who decided to attack our foursome, pilot Sutirin was shot down by Mi-109G. On another day of stay in the Cuban first began combat work our squadron. Early in the morning we six flew to the patrol area. The combat order consisted of a link led by the Deputy Squadron Commander Paskiv. In this flight he was appointed Zayev commander of the entire group. My pair provided the actions of Paskiv's link in combat with bombers.